Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. Snow had not fallen on Maple, Texas that winter, but the cold still crept through the cracks of the old farmhouse on the outskirts of Ellis County, settling into the bones of everyone who lived there. It was January 2nd, 2018, a Tuesday night that carried a strange significance for two people who had shared 18 years of marriage. John Kevin Garner, 42 years old, and his wife Sandra Louise Garner, 55, were marking their wedding anniversary, and by every outward account, the evening had passed like countless others before it. What no one inside that house could have predicted was that before the sun rose again, John would be dead, and Sandra would be at the center of one of the most contested murder investigations Texas had seen in years. John had been born in Waxahachie, a small city not far from where he would eventually build his life, on November 1st, 1975. He grew up to become the kind of man neighbors described as steady and dependable, the sort of person you could set your clock by. By the time he reached his 40s, John had risen to general manager at DHL Motors, a position that made him the primary breadwinner for his household. He was not simply providing a paycheck. He had, over nearly 2 decades, become the emotional and financial anchor for a blended family that depended on him more than most outsiders realized. Sandra had come into John's life while she was working for a shipping company in Paris, Texas. She was already a mother of 2, Andrea and Wesley, from a previous relationship, and she carried with her the weight of 2 failed marriages before she ever met John. When they fell in love, the age gap between them, 13 years, did little to slow things down. 2 years after meeting, they married, and John stepped into the role of father figure for Sandra's children, a responsibility he seemed to embrace without hesitation. For years, the Garner household functioned the way families are supposed to. But everything changed when Sandra was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a degenerative disease that slowly stripped away her physical independence. John did not waver. He became not just her husband but her caregiver, managing her medical needs while continuing to work full-time and support the family financially. To the outside world, this made John something close to a hero, a man who had absorbed both the role of provider and nurse without complaint. Inside the walls of their home, though, the pressures of illness, dependency, and years of compounding stress may have been quietly reshaping the emotional landscape of the marriage in ways no one outside could see. By the winter of 2018, the couple had weathered 18 years together, a milestone that should have been cause for celebration. Instead, it became the backdrop for tragedy. According to Sandra's own account, she was jolted awake sometime between 11 p.m. and midnight by the sound of gunshots ringing through the house. She would later tell police that she saw a masked man standing in their bedroom, a flashlight in one hand and a gun in the other. Panic overtook her, and she began to scream, hoping the noise might summon help or scare the intruder away. Instead, she said, the man ordered her to be quiet, warning her that his job there was already finished. Sandra recounted that the masked figure forced her to open the family's safe, from which he removed approximately $18,000 in cash before instructing her to count to 100 before dialing 911. When she finally made that call, her voice on the recording was frantic, the words tumbling out in a mixture of confusion and grief. She told the dispatcher that her husband had been shot while they slept side by side, and that she had performed CPR on him, desperately trying to keep him alive until help arrived. Because the incident occurred in the middle of the night, crime scene technicians could not reach the property for nearly 8 hours. In that gap, the responding officer did what he could, photographing the scene and Sandra herself with his own phone, preserving details that would later become critical pieces of evidence. When investigators finally arrived in force, they searched every room and their guns drawn, hoping to find the masked intruder Sandra described. He was nowhere to be found. The house was empty except for the grieving widow and the body of her husband. John Garner's autopsy would later confirm what the responding officers already suspected. He had been shot 3 times while he slept, and his death was ruled a homicide without question. What remained uncertain, and what would consume the community of Maple for the next 2 years, was who had pulled the trigger. Investigators are trained to notice the smallest inconsistencies, the tiny details that separate a victim's genuine trauma from a carefully constructed story. In Sandra's case, something about her demeanor unsettled the officers from very early on. Reports describe her as remarkably calm throughout multiple retellings of the events, showing little of the emotional volatility one might expect from a woman who had just watched her husband of 18 years die beside her. She repeated her account of the masked intruder several times, and each time, the details remained eerily consistent, perhaps too consistent for a story born out of chaos and fear. Detectives began pulling electronic devices from the home, standard procedure in any homicide investigation. What they found on one of Sandra's devices sent a chill through the investigation. In the days leading up to John's murder, someone had searched the internet for phrases including "how to kill somebody in their sleep," and had clicked through to an article titled 16 Ways to Kill Somebody and Not Get Caught. Other reporting described the search more starkly as "how to kill someone and not get caught," a phrase that read less like idle curiosity and more like premeditation. The physical evidence began to mount as well. John had owned an extensive collection of firearms, roughly 50 pistols and a dozen rifles, and investigators had to comb through the entire inventory to determine which weapon matched the caliber used in the shooting. They discovered that John had once gifted Sandra a rusty .38 caliber revolver, a weapon that, curiously, could not be located anywhere in the house. Gunpowder residue was also found on Sandra's hands and arms, a forensic detail that, on its own, might have several innocent explanations, but combined with everything else, painted an increasingly damning picture. Then came the discovery that would seal the case in the eyes of prosecutors. Officers searched Sandra's Ford Mustang and found a plastic bag tucked beneath the driver's seat. Inside, wrapped carefully in wet paper towels, was a rusty .38 special revolver, the very gun John had once given his wife as a gift. The weapon bore no fingerprints and no usable DNA, as though someone had gone to great lengths to erase any trace of who had handled it. Ballistics testing, completed roughly 10 days after the murder, confirmed what investigators suspected. The gun hidden in Sandra's car was the same weapon that had ended John Garner's life. On January 10, 2018, just 8 or 9 days after her husband's death, Sandra Louise Garner was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Her bond was set at an extraordinary $2 million, an amount she had no way of paying. She would spend the next 21 months confined to the Ellis County Jail, awaiting a trial that would determine not only her freedom, but the truth behind one of the most puzzling domestic murders the region had witnessed. What made the Garner case so uniquely painful was not simply the murder itself, but the way it tore apart the family left behind. Sandra's son, Wesley Miller, and her daughter, Andrea Miller, had both grown up under John's roof, and both had, in different ways, come to see him as a father. When suspicion fell on their mother, the family fractured along lines that would never fully heal. As the investigation deepened, a startling detail emerged. It was reportedly Wesley, Sandra's own son, who directed investigators toward the exact location in the Mustang where the murder weapon was eventually found. For a family already reeling from John's death, this revelation planted a seed of suspicion that would grow into open warfare. If Wesley knew where the gun was hidden, what did that say about his own involvement in his stepfather's murder? This question would become the central battleground of the trial to come. While Sandra sat in jail for a year and a half, The people who loved John Garner were left to wonder whether justice was even possible, and whether the person responsible for his death was the woman who had shared his bed for nearly 2 decades, or the young man who had once called him a father. In September 2019, the case finally reached the Ellis County Courthouse in Waxahachie, the very city where John had been born. What followed was a grueling 4-week trial that laid bare every piece of evidence, every inconsistency, and every raw emotion the case had generated over the previous year and a half. Sandra's defense attorney, Thomas Pappas, faced what appeared to be an overwhelming mountain of evidence against his client. The murder weapon hidden in her car, the damning internet searches on her device, the gunshot residue on her skin, and her position as the only other person in the house at the time of the shooting all seemed to point in one direction. Rather than attempting to dismantle each piece of evidence in isolation, Pappas built an entirely different narrative for the jury to consider. He argued that Wesley Miller, not Sandra, had murdered his stepfather and then systematically framed his own mother for the crime. The defense highlighted every misstep in the initial investigation, pointing to the 8-hour delay before crime scene technicians arrived and the reliance on a single officer's cell phone photographs to document critical evidence. Body camera footage, capturing the raw and unfiltered moments of Sandra's arrest and the early stages of the investigation, became central to the defense's strategy, used to illustrate every gap and inconsistency in how the case had been handled from the very beginning. Meanwhile, prosecutors reportedly dismissed Wesley as a serious suspect, a decision that struck many observers as strange given that they were simultaneously prosecuting his mother for the exact same murder. The prosecution, for its part, struggled with a difficult question of motive. Why would Sandra kill the man who had cared for her through the darkest years of her multiple sclerosis diagnosis, the man who had shouldered the financial and physical burden of her illness for years without complaint? It was a question that never received a fully satisfying answer in the courtroom, and it may have been the very seed of doubt that ultimately shaped the jury's decision. After 4 exhausting weeks of testimony, forensic analysis, and emotional cross-examinations, the case finally went to the jury. For a trial built on what appeared to be substantial physical evidence, what happened next stunned nearly everyone following the case. The jury deliberated for just 3 hours before returning with their verdict. Not guilty. The courtroom, according to those present, erupted the moment the words were spoken. Sandra's daughter, Andrea, would later describe the verdict as the sweetest words she had ever heard in her life. Her defense attorney fought back tears at the announcement. But on the other side of the courtroom, John Garner's extended family sat in devastated silence, watching the woman they believed had killed their loved one walk free after less than 2 years behind bars. The jury's decision reflected the strength of the defense's alternative theory. If reasonable doubt could be established by pointing to Wesley Miller as an equally plausible suspect, then the prosecution's case, however compelling on the surface, could not clear the high bar required for a first-degree murder conviction. After 21 months in the Ellis County Jail, Sandra Garner walked out of the courthouse a free woman. The verdict left more questions than answers, and it left a family permanently shattered. Sandra has continued to maintain her innocence, and by several accounts, she believes her own son was responsible for her husband's death. Wesley Miller, for his part, has continued to maintain his innocence as well, while reportedly remaining close to members of John's extended family, a detail that only deepens the tragedy of a mother and son now publicly accusing each other of murder. Because of the constitutional protection against double jeopardy, Sandra Garner cannot be tried again for John's murder, regardless of what future evidence might emerge. Wesley Miller was never formally charged in connection with the case. Today, John Kevin Garner's murder remains officially unsolved, a case where someone in that quiet Maple farmhouse pulled the trigger 3 times while a man slept beside his wife of 18 years, and yet no one has ever been held legally accountable for that act. Sandra currently resides in Maple, at the same family home where the tragedy occurred, and has said publicly that she believes John would have wanted her to move forward with her life. The question that had haunted the entire case from the beginning, a question that, even now, has never received a definitive answer. What remains, in the end, is not a tidy resolution but a lingering ache, the kind that settles over small towns after tragedies too complicated for simple answers. John Garner celebrated his 18th wedding anniversary and did not live to see the sun rise the next day. Somewhere between a masked intruder story, a chilling internet search, a hidden revolver, and a mother and son locked in mutual accusation, the truth of what happened that January night has slipped permanently out of reach, leaving behind only grief, suspicion, and a case the American justice system was never able to fully close. Story 2. The wide, windswept plains of southeastern New Mexico stretch endlessly under a sky that can turn bitterly cold in the depths of winter. Hobbs, New Mexico, is a community where everyday life moves at a steady, predictable pace, far removed from the sensational headlines of major metropolitan areas. But in January of 2022, the quiet facade of this desert town was shattered by an event so shocking that it would reverberate across the state and the nation. The biting chill of the winter air was a physical reminder of the harsh reality that was about to unfold behind a mundane, everyday shopping center. At the center of this tragedy was an 18-year-old young woman named Alexis Avila. To the outside world, she appeared to be just another teenager navigating the complex transition between high school and adulthood. Yet, beneath the surface, a storm of undiagnosed struggles was quietly brewing. The human mind, especially in its formative adolescent years, can sometimes fracture under immense pressure, leading to choices that defy all reason and basic human instinct. As the sun dipped below the horizon on that fateful January day, casting long, dark shadows over the asphalt of the local commercial district, a sequence of events was set into motion that would forever alter the lives of multiple people, most notably a helpless infant. The night of the incident enveloped the city of Hobbs in freezing temperatures, the kind of cold that bites through layers of clothing and forces residents to seek the warmth of their homes. Behind a local shopping center, a large, heavy metal dumpster sat quietly in the desolate back alley. It was the sort of place most people actively ignore, a receptacle for the discarded remnants of daily commerce. Hours had passed since the sun went down, and the alleyway remained shrouded in darkness and biting wind. It was into this unforgiving environment that a horrific secret had been carelessly tossed, hidden away in a simple plastic trash bag. A group of individuals, often described later by authorities and the community as Good Samaritans, happened to be braving the freezing night. They were rummaging through the refuse in the alley, searching the dumpsters for anything of value or use. In the quiet isolation of the alley, their mundane search was abruptly interrupted by a sound that did not belong. Amidst the rustling of discarded packaging and broken items, a faint noise emerged, a delicate, muffled whimper. The sound was almost entirely swallowed by the wind, but it was distinct enough to catch their attention. As they frantically tore into a tied trash bag, the terrifying truth was revealed. Inside, among the cold debris, lay a living, breathing newborn baby boy. The infant had been completely abandoned, left exposed to the freezing temperatures for several hours. The shock of the discovery was immediate and overwhelming. The tiny child was clinging to life, his fragile body fighting against the deadly drop in temperature. Driven by pure adrenaline and human compassion, the group immediately sprang into action. They desperately tried to warm the freezing newborn, using whatever they could find to shield him from the cruel winter air, while simultaneously placing a frantic call to local emergency dispatchers. Their timely arrival and quick thinking became the only barrier between the innocent child and a tragic death. Within minutes, the wail of sirens pierced the quiet Hobbs night. Police officers and paramedics rushed into the alleyway, the flashing red and blue lights illuminating the grim reality of the scene. The first responders immediately took over the care of the newborn, assessing his rapidly dropping body temperature and rushing him into the warmth of an ambulance. The sheer cruelty of the situation hung heavily in the air as paramedics worked feverishly to stabilize the infant, who was entirely dependent on their medical expertise to survive the trauma he had endured. Against all conceivable odds, and thanks to the miraculous intervention of the people rummaging through the trash, the baby boy remained alive. With the child rushed off to receive urgent, life-saving medical attention, the alleyway instantly transformed from a forgotten commercial backside into an active, high-stakes crime scene. Detectives from the local police department arrived to process the area, their minds grappling with the horrific nature of the crime. Who could commit such an act? How could a mother discard her own flesh and blood like ordinary refuse? The investigation began immediately, driven by a profound need to find answers and secure justice for the defenseless victim. Officers secured the perimeter, documented the contents of the dumpster, and began the meticulous process of searching for clues in the darkness. In modern criminal investigations, technology often serves as the most reliable witness. Detectives canvassing the commercial property quickly realized that the back alley was monitored by a security camera mounted on the shopping center's exterior. This camera, staring unblinkingly at the dumpster, held the key to unraveling the mystery of the abandoned child. Investigators obtained the surveillance footage and began scrolling back through the hours of recorded video, watching the mundane movements of the day in reverse. The breakthrough came when the grainy footage captured a vehicle pulling into the empty alleyway earlier that day. The recording clearly showed a young woman stepping out of the car, taking a tied trash bag from the vehicle. With a swift, casual motion, she tossed the bag into the open dumpster, turning her back on her own child. She then returned to her car and drove away, leaving the newborn to face the freezing elements alone. This chilling visual evidence became the absolute focal point of the investigation. The casual nature of the act, captured in stark black and white, provided a horrifying window into the crime. By analyzing the make, model, and distinct features of the vehicle in the video, law enforcement officials were quickly able to trace the car back to its owner. The undeniable digital trail led them straight to the door of 18-year-old Alexis Avila. In January 2022, shortly after the miraculous rescue of the baby, police officially placed Alexis Avila under arrest. The apprehension of the young woman sent immediate shockwaves through the community of Hobbs and the surrounding Lea County. Residents were left grappling with a profound sense of disbelief and sorrow. How could a local teenager, someone's daughter, neighbor, or classmate, carry out such a deeply unnatural act? The case dominated local discussions, forcing the community to confront uncomfortable realities about mental health, youth, and desperation. The interrogation of Alexis Avila provided investigators with their first look into the mindset of the young mother. Behind closed doors, detectives worked to piece together the narrative leading up to the shocking abandonment. As the details of the case trickled out to the public, the emotional weight of the story grew heavier. The incident sparked fierce and passionate conversations across New Mexico regarding the state's safe haven laws. Advocates and legislators loudly pointed out that parents are legally permitted to surrender an infant younger than 90 days old at designated safe locations, such as fire stations or hospitals, without facing any criminal consequences. The tragic irony that Avila could have safely handed her child over to professionals, yet chose a freezing dumpster instead, only deepened the public's heartbreak and outrage. As the legal wheels began to turn, Avila was formally charged with severe crimes reflecting the gravity of her actions. The prosecution built a formidable case around the central charges of abuse resulting in great bodily harm and attempted first-degree murder. Because of the severity of the charges, Avila was placed under strict house arrest while she awaited her day in court, a period that would stretch out for over a year. The trial finally commenced in April of 2023, drawing intense media scrutiny and public attention to the Lovington courtroom in Lea County. Inside the solemn halls of justice, the jury was forced to confront the darkest aspects of human behavior. Over the course of several days, prosecutors painted a picture of a calculated, heinous act. They presented the undeniable surveillance footage to the jury, forcing them to watch the moment Avila discarded her son like trash. The prosecution argued fiercely that her actions were deliberate and that she had thrown the infant away with the clear intent that he would not survive the freezing night. The defense team faced an incredibly difficult uphill battle. Representing the 19-year-old Avila, her public defender sought to contextualize the horrifying act without entirely excusing it. The defense heavily emphasized Avila's young age and lack of neurological maturity. They argued passionately that human brains are not fully developed at the age of 18, which can lead to impulsive, irrational, and catastrophic decision-making under extreme stress. Furthermore, the defense introduced crucial medical testimony asserting that Avila was suffering from an undiagnosed mental health disorder, specifically bipolar disorder, at the time of the incident. They argued that this mental illness, combined with the panic of an unexpected birth, clouded her judgment and proved that her actions were not coldly premeditated. Avila herself eventually took the stand, offering the court a direct look at the teenager behind the sensational headlines. In mid-April 2023, after days of emotionally draining testimony, both sides delivered their closing arguments. The prosecution demanded accountability for the helpless infant, while the defense pleaded for understanding regarding Avila's mental state. The jury retreated to deliberate the heavy burden placed upon them. The tension in the courthouse was palpable as the hours ticked by. Within just 3 hours, the jury returned to the courtroom with their decision. Alexis Avila was found guilty of both attempted first-degree murder and abuse resulting in great bodily harm. The abuse charge, representing a first-degree felony, carried the most severe potential penalty. The verdict offered a profound sense of validation for the prosecution and for the child who had suffered so greatly. On May 1, 2023, the courtroom was silent as District Judge William Shoebridge prepared to deliver Avila's sentence. The judge's words echoed the collective horror of the community. He did not mince words, explicitly describing the act as a heinous crime and stating that to toss one's own child into a dumpster like trash was an unforgivable event by any mother. He noted that the act went beyond the pale of the mistakes normally made by young people. Under state law, Avila faced a mandatory maximum sentence of 18 years in prison. However, the judge also carefully weighed the mitigating factors presented by the defense. Acknowledging the uncontradicted evidence of her undiagnosed bipolar disorder and her youth, Judge Shoebridge decided to suspend 2 years of the mandatory penalty. Alexis Avila was officially sentenced to 16 years in a state prison, followed by 2 years of parole. She was also granted credit for the 475 days she had already spent confined to house arrest. As the gavel fell, the weight of the 16-year sentence settled over the courtroom. Despite the severe sentence handed down in May of 2023, the legal saga of Alexis Avila was far from over. The American justice system provides avenues for appeal, and Avila's defense team immediately took advantage of this right. They filed an appeal challenging the conviction, arguing primarily that the jury had been given incorrect instructions regarding the legal definitions of the insanity defense. Because of this pending appeal, a judge controversially allowed Avila to remain out of physical custody and on release while the appellate courts reviewed her case. She was released in October 2023, sparking renewed frustration among those who felt justice was being delayed. For the next 2 years, Avila lived in a state of legal limbo, waiting for the higher courts to decide her fate. The community watched and waited, the memory of the freezing January night never fully fading from the public consciousness. Finally, on November 17, 2025, the New Mexico Court of Appeals delivered its highly anticipated ruling. The appellate court firmly disagreed with the defense's arguments, ruling that the original trial judge had handled the jury instructions correctly. With this decision, the court officially upheld Avila's conviction. New Mexico Attorney General Raul Torres publicly praised the ruling, expressing deep relief that the child had survived the horrific ordeal and stating that the state would immediately move to remand Avila back into custody. Even then, the defense made one final, desperate attempt to keep Avila out of a prison cell. In early February 2026, her legal team stood before a judge and requested a reconsideration and reduction of her 16-year sentence. On Wednesday morning, February 4th, 2026, The judge firmly denied the motion, stating that there was no legal or moral basis to alter the punishment. More than 4 years after surveillance footage captured a young woman abandoning her newborn son to the freezing elements, the doors of the Lea County Detention Center finally closed behind Alexis Avila. She officially began serving her lengthy prison sentence, of which she is expected to complete roughly 85%. District Attorney Diana Luce spoke for many when she declared that the final ruling brought a profound sense of closure to the shocking case, serving as true justice for the innocent baby boy who was left to die. The story of Alexis Avila remains a dark, cautionary tale etched into the history of New Mexico. It is a narrative of profound tragedy, mental health struggles, and the catastrophic consequences of desperation. Yet, intertwined with the darkness is a powerful thread of hope and resilience. The infant boy, discovered by chance and saved by the swift, compassionate actions of strangers, survived his harrowing entry into the world. His life stands as a testament to the enduring human spirit, a quiet victory of light over the terrible shadows of that freezing January night in Hobbs. Story 3. The town of State College, Pennsylvania, wears winter like a familiar coat. Snowbanks pile along Fraternity Row, students huddle in scarves as they cross campus, and the old brick houses along the row glow with string lights and the low hum of parties on any given weekend. In February 2017, none of that seemed unusual. It was rush season, the time when fraternities across the country welcome new pledges, when young men eager to belong walk through doors decorated with Greek letters, hoping this will be the place where they finally find their people. For 19-year-old Timothy Piazza, a sophomore engineering student from Lebanon, New Jersey, that hope led him to the door of the Beta Theta Pi house on the night of February 2nd, 2017. Tim was, by every account from those who loved him, an unremarkable kind of wonderful. He was the kind of son who called home, the kind of brother who looked out for his younger siblings, the kind of student who chose engineering because he liked building things that worked. He had transferred into Penn State's engineering program and was searching, as so many young people do, for a sense of belonging in a school of tens of thousands of students. Beta Theta Pi offered him that promise. It offered brotherhood, tradition, a house full of older students who called each other brothers, and a bid, a formal invitation to join, that Tim had been working toward for weeks. What Tim did not know, what his parents Jim and Evelyn Piazza did not know, was that behind the ivy-covered facade of that fraternity house lay a ritual with a name that sounded almost playful and was anything but the Gauntlet. The Beta Theta Pi chapter at Penn State had already been on probation once before, 8 years earlier, for alcohol violations. It was supposed to be a dry house. On paper, there was to be no drinking, no hazing, no repeat of past mistakes. But paper promises rarely survive contact with tradition, and the young men who now ran the fraternity, its president Brendan Young and its vice president and pledge master Daniel Casey, oversaw a pledge acceptance ceremony that violated every one of those rules. On the night of February 2nd, 14 pledges, Tim among them, were gathered in the fraternity's basement. They were told to drink from a large bottle of vodka, roughly 3 shots each, before being sent through a stations-based drinking course that has an obstacle course of intoxication. There was beer to chug. There was wine to drink from a bag, the kind more suited to a picnic than a hazing ritual. There was beer pong. Each station added more alcohol into young bodies that had barely eaten that day. The course of about 82 minutes, Tim Piazza was given 18 drinks, and never once did he pour his own. He drank because he was told to drink, because saying no might have meant losing the very brotherhood he had come there hoping to find. By the time the gauntlet ended, Tim's blood alcohol concentration would later be estimated at somewhere between 0.28 and 0.36, nearly 4 times the legal limit for driving in Pennsylvania. He was, by any clinical definition, in a state of medical danger. But to the young men around him, swaying, laughing, stumbling was simply what a good pledge night looked like. Surveillance cameras mounted throughout the house, 12 of them in total, would later capture what happened next in unbearable, silent detail. There was no soundtrack to the footage, no dialogue, just time-stamped images of a young man's body failing him, frame by frame, hour by hour, while the house around him carried on as if nothing were wrong. Sometime around 11 o'clock that night, Tim Piazza fell. He tumbled headfirst down a flight of basement stairs, his body crumpling at the bottom in a way that should have sent every person nearby running for help. Fraternity brothers did come to him. They picked him up. But instead of calling for medical attention, they carried him upstairs and laid him on a couch, where they tried to revive him themselves, pouring water on his face and slapping him, hoping he would simply wake up the way anyone who has had too much to drink is supposed to eventually wake up. He did not simply wake up. Over the hours that followed, Tim fell again, more than once, his uncoordinated body no longer able to protect itself from gravity. The surveillance video showed him stumbling into walls, collapsing, being left alone for long stretches on the couch and later on the floor, his skin gradually losing its color, his breathing growing labored. Fraternity brothers who checked on him noted he looked unwell. Text messages exchanged that night revealed young men joking about his condition, worrying about whether he would be all right, and worrying, too, about what would happen to the fraternity if anyone found out how bad things had gotten. Nobody called 911. Hour after hour passed in that house while a 19-year-old lay dying on a couch a few feet from people who might have saved him. Nearly 12 hours slipped by between his first fall and the moment anyone dialed for an ambulance. The call finally came at 10:48 or 10:49 the following morning, February 3rd, only after his condition had become so visibly dire, his skin taking on a gray pallor, blood on his face, that even those most desperate to protect the fraternity's secret could no longer look away. When paramedics finally arrived at the Beta Theta Pi house, they found Tim Piazza in critical condition. He was rushed to a hospital, where doctors discovered the true extent of what had happened to his body during those hidden hours. He had suffered a ruptured spleen, internal bleeding, and traumatic brain injuries consistent with repeated, violent falls. Surgeons operated, trying to control the hemorrhaging and the swelling in his skull, but the damage from 12 hours of untreated internal injury had already done its terrible work. Jim and Evelyn Piazza received the phone call every parent dreads, the one that begins with a hospital's name and ends with words no parent is prepared to hear. They rushed to be with their son, watching machines breathe for him, watching monitors track a body that was failing despite every medical effort to save it. On February 4th, 2017, 2 days after he walked through the doors of a fraternity house hoping to become a brother, Timothy Piazza died. He was 19 years old. News of Tim's death spread quickly through Penn State and then across the country. But what truly shocked the public was not simply that a young man had died. Deaths tied to fraternity hazing, tragically, were not new. What stunned people was the sheer amount of evidence, video evidence, capturing exactly what had happened, and the apparent effort by some of those present to hide it rather than help him. A grand jury convened to examine the case, poring over the surveillance footage, phone records, and witness testimony recovered from inside the Beta Theta Pi house. What they found led investigators to conclude, in stark language, that Tim Piazza's death was no accident. It was, the grand jury said, the direct result of reckless decisions made by people who had the power to help him and chose, again and again, not to. The grand jury's report went further, revealing that after Tim was taken to the hospital, several fraternity members had scrambled to cover their tracks. Detectives testified that surveillance footage from the house's own basement camera appeared to have been deleted. Text messages discussing whether to erase evidence were uncovered. Some brothers described cleaning up the house, hiding alcohol, and rehearsing what they would tell police before anyone had even called an ambulance for their dying pledge. In May 2017, prosecutors announced criminal charges against 18 members of the fraternity, a number that would eventually grow to more than 24 young men swept into the case in one form or another. The most serious charges included involuntary manslaughter, aggravated assault, reckless endangerment, hazing, and evidence tampering. The fraternity itself, as an organization, faced charges too, and Penn State moved swiftly to permanently ban Beta Theta Pi from campus. Later that year, a separate investigative report examining Penn State's own oversight of Greek life delivered a scathing verdict. It accused university administrators of what it called shocking apathy toward known dangers of excessive drinking and hazing within the fraternity system. The report stated bluntly that Tim Piazza did not have to die, and that officials had long been aware that it was only a matter of time before such a tragedy occurred. What followed was a legal battle that stretched across years, marked by setbacks for prosecutors and heartbreak for the Piazza family, who sat through hearing after hearing hoping to see accountability match the scale of what had happened to their son. Some of the most serious charges, including involuntary manslaughter and aggravated assault against several defendants, were eventually dismissed by the court, a decision that left many observers questioning whether the justice system could adequately address the culture that had allowed Tim's death to happen. Still, accountability came piece by piece. In June 2018, Ryan Burke became the first former fraternity member to plead guilty, admitting to charges including hazing and providing liquor to minors, acknowledging that he had been among those who forced Tim to drink from the vodka bottle that started his final night. Others followed in the months and years after. In 2019, for more former Beta Theta Pi brothers Luke Visser, Joseph Sala, Joshua Kerchevsky, and Michael Bonatucci, were sentenced by a judge in Center County Court after pleading guilty to hazing-related charges, receiving jail terms ranging from 30 days to 9 months. The final chapter in the criminal case did not close until 2024, more than 7 years after Tim died. Brendan Young, the fraternity's president, and Daniel Casey, its vice president and pledge master, the two young men who had presided over the gauntlet that night, pleaded guilty to 14 counts of hazing, one for each pledge subjected to the ritual, and a single count of reckless endangerment specifically tied to what happened to Tim. On October 1st, 2024, a judge sentenced both men to 2 to 4 months in jail, with eligibility for work release, followed by 3 years of probation and community service. Pennsylvania's Attorney General, Michelle Henry, marked the sentencing with a statement that seemed to speak for everyone who had followed the case for years. "There should be no discussion of this case," she said, without recognizing the tragic loss of life and the devastation it had caused for Tim Piazza's family and friends. For Jim and Evelyn Piazza, courtrooms and sentencing hearings were never going to be enough to make sense of losing their son. In the wake of Tim's death, they transformed their grief into advocacy, appearing before lawmakers, speaking to reporters, and pushing tirelessly for changes to the laws governing hazing in Pennsylvania and beyond. Their efforts helped drive the passage of what became known as the Timothy J. Piazza Anti-Hazing Law, legislation that, for the first time, established felony-level charges for hazing incidents that result in serious injury or death, closing a gap that had previously allowed such tragedies to be treated as little more than misdemeanors. Years after Tim's death, his father continued speaking publicly, warning incoming college students and their families about the hidden dangers still present in fraternity rush culture, reminding audiences that hazing tragedies happen not just to troubled young people, but to good kids from good families who simply wanted to belong somewhere. It was, in its way, the truest tribute the Piazzas could offer their son, turning his death into a warning that might spare some other family the same unbearable phone call they once received. The Beta Theta Pi house on Penn State's fraternity row no longer bears the letters that once hung above its door. Penn State's Greek system underwent sweeping reforms in the years following Tim's death, including new restrictions on pledge events, stricter alcohol policies, and closer monitoring of chapters previously left largely to police themselves. Whether these changes have been enough remains a question that echoes through every subsequent hazing case reported at colleges around the country. What is certain is that Tim Piazza's story is no longer simply about one night in one basement. It became a case study cited in classrooms, a legal precedent referenced in courtrooms, and a name spoken by grieving parents and lawmakers alike whenever the conversation turns to fraternity hazing. It is the story of a young man who wanted nothing more than friendship and belonging, who trusted an institution built on brotherhood, and who was failed hour after hour by the very people who called themselves his brothers. Somewhere in New Jersey, there is a family that still marks February 2nd and February 4th every year, not as ordinary winter dates on a calendar, but as the beginning and the end of the worst 3 days of their lives. And somewhere in Pennsylvania's legal code now sits a law that carries their son's name, a quiet, permanent reminder that a life once slipped away in silence, unheard and unhelped, in the 12 long hours when anyone, should have simply picked up a phone. Story 4. The sun had not yet fully risen over the Texas Hill Country on the morning of April 16, 2003, when Colonel Philip Michael Shue rose in the dark of his bedroom in Bernie, a quiet town just northwest of San Antonio, and did what he did nearly every morning of his marriage. He made coffee, and he brought his wife Tracy her cup in bed. They talked, as they always did, about ordinary things. The house they had just put a deposit on in Alabama, the pond out back, the new chapter of retirement waiting for them just beyond the horizon of that spring. Phil, a 54-year-old Air Force psychiatrist known for a gentleness that seemed almost old-fashioned, a Midwestern warmth that lit up a room, kissed his wife goodbye, told her he loved her, and left for Lackland Air Force Base a little earlier than usual to get some paperwork done. Those were the last words Tracy Shue would ever hear him say. 2.5 hours later, at 8:14 that morning, witnesses along Interstate 10, near the Johns Road exit outside San Antonio, watched a gold Mercury Tracer weave erratically down the highway before it veered off the road entirely and slammed into a patch of small trees. The driver's side of the car crumpled violently on impact. Emergency crews arrived expecting to find the aftermath of an ordinary, terrible accident. A man killed instantly by blunt trauma to the head. That much, at least, was true. Lieutenant Roger Anderson, one of the first investigators on scene, would confirm that the crash itself had caved in the driver's side and caused fatal head trauma. But what the first responders found beneath that damage stopped them cold. Philip Shue's shirt had been torn open from his chest to his navel, not by the crash, but seemingly by human hands. Down the center of his chest ran a 6-inch vertical incision, an inch wide, cut with what investigators would later describe as surgical precision. Both of his nipples had been removed entirely. The tip of one finger and part of an earlobe were missing, taken cleanly, and never recovered. His wrists bore the marks of duct tape, wrapped and left dangling at the ends, and more tape was found looped around his ankles and the tops of his boots. There were other injuries too, bruises and marks that suggested, to some who examined them, that a struggle had taken place before the crash ever happened. It was by any measure one of the strangest crime scenes Lieutenant Anderson had encountered in his career. He recalled the chaos that followed almost as vividly as the wounds themselves. State police had also responded to the crash, and a jurisdictional dispute broke out over who had authority over the scene. A dispute so heated that Anderson admitted he eventually screamed at the other officers to leave what he considered his crime scene. In the confusion, the vehicle itself was not properly preserved, and neither, in the eyes of later investigators, was the scene around it. It was a mistake that would haunt the case for years, a wound in the investigation almost as deep as the one carved into Philip Shue's chest. That evening, Tracy Shue waited at home, unaware that anything was wrong, until the sheriff and a minister arrived at her door around 3:30 in the afternoon, hours after the crash had happened. She would never understand why it took so long for anyone to tell her. Not long after, a Texas Department of Public Safety investigator named Al Oxier sat with her in her living room and, almost as an afterthought, asked a question that would change the direction of her life forever. Was there any reason her husband might have had duct tape around his wrists and ankles? In that instant, still in shock, still processing the idea that her husband was simply gone, Tracy's mind went somewhere specific. She thought of the letters. What Tracy thought of in that moment, it helps to go back further, to a marriage that had ended more than a decade before Phil Shue ever met her. Phil's first marriage, to a woman named Nancy, had ended in 1992 after 20 difficult years. A divorced Tracy would later describe her husband discussing only briefly, saying simply that there had not been much love left in it by the end. As part of that divorce settlement, Nancy retained ownership of life insurance policies on Phil's life worth roughly $1 million, an arrangement that, at the time, seemed like a routine detail of a messy but unremarkable split. Phil and Tracy met in 1988 at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, where Tracy worked as an Air Force nurse. They married in 1993, and by every account Tracy would later give, the years that followed were some of the happiest of both their lives. Friends and neighbors like Nina Willard, who lived beside them in Bernie, remembered Phil as soft-spoken and mild, a steady contrast to Tracy's more animated New York energy, and remembered the two of them as a couple who seemed simply content. That contentment began to erode in the late 1990s, when Phil started asking Nancy to cancel the insurance policies she still held on his life. She refused. He pressed the issue further after receiving an anonymous, typewritten letter warning him that his life might be in danger, a letter that claimed someone had overheard a conversation between Nancy and her new husband, an active-duty Air Force pilot named Donald Timpson, discussing a plot to have Phil killed for the insurance money. The letter urged him simply to be careful. More letters followed in the years after, each one deepening a fear that friends said Phil had never shown any sign of before in his life. He tried to have the policies canceled through the insurance company, USAA, but was told only the policy's owner, Nancy, held that authority. He wrote directly to his ex-wife, confronting her about what he had heard, telling her he felt helpless to stop what he called his eventual murder if she hired good assassins, a phrase almost impossible to read now without a chill. Nancy wrote back denying any involvement, suggesting the letters might be someone's cruel idea of a joke. Tracy watched her husband change under the weight of that fear. The man who had never once shown symptoms of anxiety or depression before those letters arrived began to carry a heaviness that never fully lifted, according to Tracy's account of those years. He confided in his psychiatrist, Dr. Douglas Dion, who would later say Shu was responding well to therapy in the months before his death, improving, not spiraling, though Dion also recalled that Phil had described a disturbing dream roughly 6 months before he died. A dream in which his car went out of control on the way to work and great violence was done to him. In the days after the crash, investigators faced an almost impossible puzzle. How does a man die from a car crash and yet arrive at the scene already bearing wounds the crash could not have caused? The Behar County Medical Examiner's Office, led by the well-regarded forensic pathologist Dr. Vincent D. Mayo, took nearly a year to reach a conclusion. D. Mayo's office found traces of the local anesthetic lidocaine in Shu's system, injected, they believed, into each nipple and into the center of his chest before the incisions were made. To D. Mayo, that detail was the key that unlocked the entire mystery. No attacker torturing a victim would bother to numb the pain first, he reasoned. Only a person harming himself, carefully and deliberately, would think to do that. D. Mayo's conclusion, ultimately endorsed by local and state police and by the Air Force itself after a lengthy joint investigation, was almost impossible to imagine yet, in his eyes, undeniable given the evidence. Philip Shu, they concluded, had mutilated his own chest, removed his own nipple tissue, cut off part of his own finger and earlobe, wrapped his own wrists and ankles in duct tape, and then deliberately driven his car off the highway in an elaborately staged act of suicide, designed, perhaps, to look like something far more sinister had been done to him. A grand jury of 12 citizens reviewed the case and found no evidence of a crime, allowing the finding of suicide to stand. 2 years after his death, the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology released a lengthy document known as a psychological autopsy, a 20-plus page report that painted a portrait of a man who had grown depressed, irrational, and paranoid in the final months of his life, and who, the report concluded, had no credible evidence to support the existence of any real threat against him. It went so far as to question whether the warning letters had ever been genuine at all. To the authors of that report, Everything, the letters, the fear, the final drive, added up to a mind that had quietly broken. Tracy Shue never accepted a word of it. For Tracy, the idea that her husband had calmly injected himself with anesthetic and then carved away pieces of his own body before driving to his death defied everything she knew about the man she had loved for 15 years. She pointed to a detail that seemed, to her, impossible to reconcile with the theory of suicide. Witnesses had seen his car driving erratically for those final minutes. But if Phil had staged his own death and inflicted these wounds himself in some remote location, why drive back onto a busy interstate, passing exit after exit toward his own town of Bernie, passing hospitals, carrying a working cell phone the entire time, rather than simply ending things quietly and privately? DiMaio himself acknowledged this was the detail that made the case, in his own words, so bizarre, unlike anything he had encountered in his long career. Tracy hired her own forensic expert, the renowned pathologist Dr. Cyril Wecht, a man who had lent his expertise to cases as significant as the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Wecht performed his own examination of the evidence and reached the opposite conclusion from DiMaio. He found no identifiable injection site to support the theory of self-administered anesthetic, no needle, no syringe, and no cutting instrument anywhere connected to Colonel Shue. He noted that no fingerprints belonging to Shue were found on the duct tape recovered from his body, and that no gloves were ever found either, details that, to Wecht, suggested someone else's hands had been at work that morning. He called the wounds consistent with torture, deliberate, controlled, and sexual in nature, the kind of injury pattern sometimes associated with sadomasochistic practices. That last detail led Tracy toward a suspicion she could not set aside. Court documents from the divorce years earlier revealed that Nancy Shue was a board-certified sex therapist who had studied sadomasochism professionally. 2 months after Phil's death, Tracy filed a civil lawsuit naming Nancy Shue and 2 insurance companies as defendants, arguing that the companies had a duty to cancel the policies once warned of a credible threat, and that Nancy bore responsibility for what had happened. During a deposition in that case, Tracy's attorney asked Nancy a direct and devastating question. Was she responsible for the death of Colonel Philip Shue? Nancy Shue invoked her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, refusing to answer. She would do so more than 20 times throughout the deposition, declining to address any question touching on murder, motive, or torture. Nancy maintained through her own written statements that she had never been involved, and no law enforcement agency ever formally named her or her husband, Donald Timpson, as suspects or persons of interest in the case, and both later stated they could account for their whereabouts at work in Florida on the morning Phil died. Investigator Roger Anderson, the same officer who had once fought for control of a chaotic crash scene, came to believe over time that his own investigation had been badly compromised from its earliest hours. He would later admit, with evident regret, that the evidence had not been preserved properly, that the vehicle itself had not been treated as part of a genuine crime scene, and that these failures had likely doomed any real chance of resolving the case with certainty. He developed his own theory, one he could never prove, that Phil had been intercepted somewhere on his way to work that morning, taken briefly by force, perhaps meant only to be terrorized rather than killed, before somehow tearing free of his restraints and fleeing back to his car in a desperate, doomed attempt to escape. By June 2008, more than 5 years after Phil's death, Tracy's civil suit against USAA finally reached trial in a Texas courtroom. Midway through, in a dramatic turn, the parties agreed to let Judge Bill Palmer decide the case alone rather than continue before a jury. Palmer ruled that USAA had not acted improperly in refusing to cancel the disputed policy, a legal defeat for Tracy on that narrow question, but it was his second finding that stunned everyone in the courthouse. The judge declared, based on the evidence before him, that the death of Colonel Philip Shue on April 16, 2003, was a homicide. For Tracy, after 5 years of fighting, of grief compounded by disbelief, of watching her husband's name attached to a word she refused to accept, the ruling offered something she had been chasing since that afternoon in her living room, a form of vindication. But the ruling came with painful limits. Judge Palmer's decision carried weight in the civil case, yet he pointed to no specific person as responsible, and he possessed no authority to compel a change to the official record. Kendall County officials refused to alter Colonel Shue's death certificate, and in June 2009, The Texas Attorney General upheld that refusal, leaving the official cause of death as suicide, a formal designation that stands to this day. Even as a judge, on the record, called it murder. The insurance payouts that had first drawn Phil Shue's fear into the light were, in the end, distributed regardless of any of it. Nancy received the $1 million from the policy she had refused to cancel. Tracy received a separate payment of $1.8 million. Money that had once seemed to feel like the very engine of a plot against his life simply changed hands, unresolved, alongside a truth that no court, no medical examiner, and no grieving widow could ever fully pin down. Philip Shue was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery in the spring of 2005, buried with full military honors, his cousin promising over the casket that the mission for truth would continue. Tracy Shue kept that promise as best she could for years afterward, tending a garden at their old home in Bernie in his memory, still insisting, long after the official file had closed, that a crime had been committed against the man she loved before that car ever left the road. Somewhere between the psychiatrist's careful analysis of lidocaine levels and the judge's quiet declaration of homicide, the truth of what happened to Philip Shue on that ordinary spring morning remains exactly where it has stood for more than 2 decades. Unresolved, contested, and for the people who loved him, unbearably unfinished. Story 5. The ancient city of Besançon, nestled in the rolling hills of eastern France near the Swiss border, is a place of quiet beauty and scholarly tradition. Its heart is the University of Franche-Comté, an institution that draws students from around the world, their youthful energy a vibrant counterpoint to the city's centuries-old stone architecture. In the autumn of 2016, this picturesque city became the new home of Narumi Kurosaki. At 21, she was the embodiment of bright, hopeful ambition. A student from the University of Tsukuba in Japan, she had come to Besançon to immerse herself in the French language and culture, her future a canvas of limitless possibility. Narumi was more than just a student. She was a beloved daughter and sister, a young woman with a radiant smile and a gentle spirit. She moved into a room on the 2nd floor of the Theodore Rousseau University residence, a standard, unassuming dormitory that would, in the space of a few terrible hours, become the center of a murder investigation that would span 3 continents and hold 2 nations in its grip. Narumi's journey to France was also an escape. For the past year, her life had been increasingly entangled with that of Nicolas Zepeda Contreras, a young man she had met in Japan in 2014. Zepeda was the son of a wealthy and influential Chilean family, his father a high-ranking executive at a telecommunications giant. He was handsome, intelligent, and charismatic, and for a time, their relationship was a passionate romance, a whirlwind of travel and youthful love. But beneath the polished surface, a darkness was festering in Zepeda. He was a man consumed by a possessive, jealous rage, a pathological need for control that began to suffocate Narumi. The relationship became toxic, a cycle of emotional abuse and manipulation. Her move to France in August 2016 was a declaration of independence, a chance to start fresh, away from the shadow of his obsession. In Besançon, Narumi blossomed. She made new friends, excelled in her studies, and began a new relationship with another student, Arthur Del Piccolo. For the first time in a long time, she was free. But Zepeda, an ocean away in Chile, was not willing to let her go. His obsession, fueled by the rejection, metastasized into a cold, calculated plan for revenge. In September 2016, he posted a chilling video online, an ultimatum delivered in broken English. In it, he spoke of Narumi, not as a former love, but as property that had defied his ownership. "She has to pay a little for what she has done," he said, his voice laced with a menacing calm. He laid out a series of conditions that she had to follow and warned, "If she cannot follow these conditions, I will enforce these conditions with immediate effect." The video was a digital death threat, a declaration of intent that was as terrifying as it was public. He later deleted it, but the threat lingered in the digital ether, a ghost of the violence to come. In late November 2016, Zepeda put his plan into motion. He flew from Chile to Europe, telling his family he was attending a conference in Geneva. It was a lie. His true destination was Besançon. He was a predator on the hunt, his movements a study in premeditated malice. He rented a car and for several days he stalked Narumi, his presence a secret, malevolent shadow in her new life. He went to a supermarket and purchased a 5-liter container of flammable liquid, matches, and detergent, a killer's toolkit. He was not there to win her back, he was there to erase her. On the evening of Sunday, December 4th, 2016, he made his move. He confronted Narumi at her dormitory. The details of their initial encounter are known only to him, but he somehow convinced her to have dinner with him. They drove to La Table de Gustave, a restaurant in the nearby town of Ornans. Surveillance footage captured them there, a surreal image of a killer dining with his victim, a final, horrifying supper. They left the restaurant just before 10 p.m., and at 10:58 p.m., the cameras at the Theodore Rousseau residence recorded them entering the building, walking together toward Narumi's room. It was the last time Narumi Kurosaki was ever seen alive. The hours that followed were a symphony of horror, its terrible music heard by a dozen students in the dormitory. In the dead of night, between 3:18 and 3:21 a.m., the silence of the residence hall was shattered by a series of terrifying screams. A Scottish student named Rachel, her room on the same floor as Narumi's, was jolted from her sleep. "I'm so terrified," she wrote in a frantic series of text messages to her friends. It sounded like someone was being murdered. Another student, Anne-Laure, heard a loud boom, followed by high-pitched screams, then another boom, and then a terrible final silence. Adrian, in a room on the floor above, heard screams that ended like a rattle, like someone who was trying to scream but couldn't anymore. 2 male students, alerted by the commotion, ventured out into the hallway, but the building had fallen silent again. The storm had passed. In room 106, the life of Narumi Kurosaki had been extinguished. Nicholas Cepeda, in the terrible quiet that followed, began the second phase of his plan, the cover-up. It was as meticulous and as cold-blooded as the murder itself. Sometime after the murder, Narumi's new boyfriend, Arthur Del Piccolo, concerned that he hadn't heard from her, came to her dorm. As he stood outside her door, he received a series of text messages from her phone. She had found someone else, the messages said. She was leaving him. It was a cruel and calculated lie, a ghost in the machine typing a final, false goodbye. For the next week, a digital phantom of Narumi Kurosaki continued to exist. Messages were sent from her social media accounts to her friends and family in Japan, their content designed to create the illusion that she was alive and well, that she had simply decided to leave, that there was no cause for alarm. On December 6th, her bank card was used to purchase a one-way train ticket to Lyon, but the seat she was assigned was empty, the passengers seated nearby later testifying that they had never seen a young Japanese woman on the train. Cepeda was creating a false trail, a series of digital breadcrumbs leading away from the truth, away from the silent, empty room in Besançon. But Narumi's friends and family were not fooled. She had never missed a class, had never gone a day without speaking to her family. This sudden, strange silence was terrifyingly out of character. On December 14th, after days of unanswered calls and growing dread, the university alerted the police. The next day, investigators entered her room. The scene was unnervingly tidy, a stark contrast to Narumi's usually messy habits. Her laptop was there, as was her wallet, containing over 500 euros. But her only winter coat was gone, as were her passport, her phone, and a single distinctive blanket. It was a room that had been staged, cleaned, and curated by a killer. The forensic analysis of the room, however, told a different story. Zepeda's fingerprints were found on a cup. His DNA was found on a water bottle, on a t-shirt, on the walls, and on the bathroom floor. And on the emergency exit door, the one he had used to leave the building, they found traces of Narumi's blood. By the time the police were piecing together the crime, Nicholas Cepeda was gone. He had driven his rental car to Geneva, dropped it off, and flown back to Chile, believing he had gotten away with the perfect no-body murder. The French authorities, now certain they had their man, issued an international arrest warrant. But the legal battle to bring him back to France would be a long and arduous one, a diplomatic and judicial odyssey that would take over 3 years. While Zepeda was living freely in Chile, protected by a legal system that was reluctant to extradite one of its own, the French investigation continued. They built a mountain of circumstantial evidence. They had the CCTV footage, the forensic evidence from the room, the witness testimony of the screams in the night. They discovered his purchase of the flammable liquid and detergent. They spoke to his cousin, Juan Felipe Ramirez, who revealed that Zepeda, during a visit to Barcelona before his return to Chile, had asked him strange, disturbing questions about death by suffocation, and had referred to Narumi in the past tense. Finally, in May of 2020, after years of diplomatic pressure, the Chilean Supreme Court approved Zepeda's extradition. In July, he was put on a plane and flown back to France, a man finally forced to confront the ghosts of his past. The trial of Nicolas Zepeda began on March 29, 2022, in the Cour d'Assises of Besançon. It was a legal spectacle of international proportions, with simultaneous translations in French, Japanese, and Spanish, and clocks on the wall displaying the time in all 3 countries. Narumi's mother, Teiko, and her 2 younger sisters, Hanami and Kurumi, made the heartbreaking journey from Tokyo to face the man who had stolen their beloved daughter and sister from them. Zepeda's parents also came from Chile, their presence a silent, unwavering testament to their belief in their son's innocence. The trial was a collision of 2 irreconcilable realities. The prosecution, led by the formidable prosecutor Etienne Manteau, laid out the dizzying array of evidence, a powerful, interlocking case that painted a picture of a narcissistic, obsessive man who had committed a cold, premeditated murder. They played the audio of the screams, a sound that chilled the courtroom to the bone, and they presented Zepeda's own words, his threatening video, as evidence of his murderous intent. Zepeda, defended by Jacqueline Lafont, one of France's most high-profile lawyers, maintained his innocence. He was a man caught in a waking nightmare, a victim of a terrible misunderstanding. The screams, he claimed, were not screams of terror, but Narumi's moans of pleasure. "We were making love all night," he told the court, his explanation a grotesque desecration of the memory of the woman he had killed. The story of the messages from her phone, the train ticket to Lyon, it was all a misunderstanding, a lie told to protect Narumi from her new, possessive boyfriend, Arthur. His testimony was a masterclass in deflection and denial, the performance of a man who believed he could talk his way out of anything. Narumi's mother, in a moment of profound and heartbreaking dignity, took the stand. "This man took my treasure," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She described her daughter as a pearl and Zepeda as a demon. She pleaded with him, as she had done for years, to tell her where her daughter's body was, to give her the simple, human dignity of a place to mourn. Zepeda sat, unmoved, his face a blank mask. On April 12, 2022, after a 2-week trial, the jury returned its verdict. They found Nicolas Zepeda guilty of the premeditated murder of Narumi Kurosaki. He was sentenced to 28 years in prison. The verdict was a moment of profound, if incomplete, justice for Narumi's family. They had a conviction, but they did not have their daughter. Her body, despite extensive searches in the vast, dense forests of the Jura region, has never been found. But the legal saga was not over. Zepeda, ever the fighter, appealed the verdict. The retrial began in December 2023, exactly 7 years after Narumi's disappearance. Zepeda, who had now learned French in prison, once again protested his innocence. "I did not kill Narumi," he told the court. "It has been a real nightmare." The second trial largely replayed the first, a painful rehashing of the evidence and the testimony. On December 22nd, the appeals court upheld the conviction and the 28-year sentence. Even then, the story did not end. Zepeda's defense team appealed to the Court of Cassation, France's highest court of appeal. In a stunning and extremely rare decision, the court, in February 2025, quashed the verdict and ordered a third trial. The decision was based on a procedural error. During the appeal trial, a police investigator had testified using new evidence that had not been submitted during the initial trial, a violation of Zepeda's right to a fair defense. The monster, it seemed, had found a loophole. As of late 2025, Nicholas Zepeda remains incarcerated, awaiting his third trial, a final roll of the legal dice in a game he has been playing for nearly a decade. The story of Narumi Kurosaki is a story that refuses to end, a saga of love, obsession, and a murder without a body. It is a story that has exposed the complexities of international law, the agonizingly slow turning of the wheels of justice, and the dark, tangled psychology of a killer who believed he was smart enough to get away with it. But most of all, it is the story of a young woman from Japan who came to France with a dream, and of a family that has traveled the world in a desperate, heartbreaking, and unending search, not just for justice, but for the one thing that has been denied them: a place to lay their daughter, their sister, their treasure to rest. Story 6. The night air in Ogden, Utah, hung heavy with the chill of early October, the kind that seeped into bones and whispered of changes yet to come. Streetlights flickered along Jackson Avenue, casting long shadows over modest homes where families tried to carve out ordinary lives amid the quiet hum of a city that rarely made headlines for violence. But on that fateful Saturday morning, October 18th, 2025, the peace shattered like fragile glass under the weight of gunshots that echoed through the darkness. In the heart of one such home near 3600 Jackson Avenue, 15-year-old Chanel Alvarez lay asleep in her bedroom, her dreams perhaps filled with the simple joys of youth, school friends, summer camps, and the tentative excitement of a first love. Chanel was the sort of girl who brightened rooms without trying. Her smile, wide and genuine, had a way of drawing people in, making them feel seen in a world that often overlooked the young. She attended Ben Lomond High School, where she navigated the awkward rhythms of teenage life with a curiosity that knew no bounds. Friends remembered her as compassionate, always ready with a kind word or a helping hand, her laughter a melody that cut through the noise of crowded hallways. But beneath that vibrant exterior, Chanel carried the weight of a family pieced together through resilience. Her mother working long hours to keep the roof over their heads, siblings and extended family weaving a safety net of love in a neighborhood where stability was hard-won. It was around 1 a.m. when the doorbell rang, a soft intrusion into the stillness of the house. Chanel's mother, weary from her shift, answered to find Hezekiah Plummer standing on the porch. At 16, Hezekiah was tall and lanky, his features sharp with the angularity of adolescence, his eyes shadowed by something indefinable. Perhaps the restlessness of a boy who felt the world closing in too soon. He lived in Clearfield, a short drive away, but his home life was a tangle of absences and arguments, the kind that pushed teens like him to seek refuge elsewhere. "I got nowhere to stay," he said, his voice low, carrying the plea of someone used to being turned away. Chanel, overhearing from her room, vouched for him. "It's okay, Mom," she murmured, her trust in him unwavering. They had been dating for months, their relationship a mix of youthful passion and the uncertainties that came with it. Hezekiah had spent substantial time at the Alvarez home before, crashing on the couch or sharing quiet moments with Chanel. Her mother, seeing no immediate harm, relented and let him in, the door clicking shut behind him like a seal on an unspoken promise of safety. The house settled back into quiet, the creak of floorboards fading as everyone returned to their beds. A witness in the home, perhaps a family member or close relative staying over, drifted into sleep, unaware of the storm brewing upstairs. Hezekiah made his way to Chanel's room, the door closing softly behind them. What passed between them in those private hours remains shrouded in the mystery of intimate moments, but tension simmered beneath the surface. Hezekiah, known to run away from his own family, carried burdens that manifested in small rebellions. Skipping school, hanging with the wrong crowd, dipping into the shadows of petty troubles that escalated in a town where opportunities felt scarce. Chanel, ever the optimist, might have tried to pull him back, her words gentle but firm, urging him toward better choices. But words can only do so much when emotions run hot and unchecked. Sometime after 2:30 a.m., the first sounds pierced the night, gunshots, distant at first, popping like firecrackers in the far-off streets. They jolted the witness awake, his heart pounding as he lay still, listening. Ogden wasn't immune to stray bullets or late-night disturbances, but something about the rhythm felt off, erratic. Then, closer now, a single shot rang out, sharp, intimate, as if the barrel of the gun had whispered right against the walls of the house. Panic surged through him. He bolted from bed, feet hitting the cold floor, racing toward the stairs to check on the children, on everyone. Up the staircase he climbed, breath ragged, only to collide with Hezekiah descending in a blur of motion. The boy's face was flushed, eyes wild with a fear that masked deeper turmoil. In his hand, glinting under the dim hallway light, was a gun, a Glock, sleek and deadly, its weight foreign yet familiar in his grip. "Someone tried to rob us," Hezekiah gasped, his words tumbling out in a rush, pointing the blame outward like a shield. He named another boy, a shadowy figure from the neighborhood, as if conjuring an intruder could rewrite the horror unfolding. Before the witness could process, Hezekiah shoved past, bolting down the stairs and out the front door into the enveloping night, the screen door slamming like a final accusation. The witness's legs carried him to Chanel's room, the air thick with the metallic tang of gunpowder. There she lay, her body crumpled on the bed, a single gunshot wound to her head staining the pillows with crimson. The bullet had entered close range, the force stealing her breath, her future, in an instant that defied comprehension. Blood pooled slowly, a silent testament to the violence that had invaded their home. Trembling, the witness fumbled for his phone, dialing 911 with fingers that refused to steady. "There's been a shooting," he choked out to the dispatcher, the words foreign on his tongue. She's not moving." Sirens wailed in response, cutting through the pre-dawn hush as Ogden Police Department officers converged on the scene just before 3 a.m. The street, usually quiet at this hour, now pulsed with flashing lights, neighbors peering from windows, their faces etched with shock. Officers secured the perimeter, their boots crunching on the gravel as they entered the home. The air inside was heavy, charged with grief and urgency. They confirmed Chanel's death on sight, the wound too severe, the life already fled. Her mother, roused from sleep by the commotion, stumbled into the chaos, her world collapsing as paramedics delivered the unimaginable news. "No," she whispered, collapsing against the wall, her sobs raw and unending. She had just seen her daughter alive hours before, vibrant and full of promise. As the first responders worked, detectives began piecing together the fragments. The mother's account painted a timeline. Hezekiah's arrival at 1 a.m., his search for a backpack in her room, odd, insistent, before retreating to Chanel's space. Now, that Glock she had purchased weeks earlier was gone, its empty box discarded in the bedroom like a cruel clue. A single bullet casing lay in the hallway outside the door, gleaming accusingly under the forensic lights. Outside, the scene grew more puzzling. Possible bullet holes pockmarked the exterior walls, and 7 shell casings littered the street a significant distance away, as if a skirmish had erupted in the shadows. But the angles didn't align. Those distant shots couldn't have reached Chanel's head from her bed. Investigators zeroed in. The bedroom held only traces of her and Hezekiah. No signs of forced entry, no struggle beyond the intimate betrayal of a shot fired at close quarters. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit community, whispers turning to murmurs of disbelief. Chanel wasn't just a name. She was a fixture at Good Shepherd Lutheran Church, where Pastor Jeff Stevenson had watched her grow over summers at camp. He remembered her vividly, her infectious smile, the way she'd engage with younger kids, her boundless curiosity lighting up group discussions. She was spectacular, he later told reporters, his voice cracking with the weight of loss. Always caring, compassionate. This is devastating, something no family should endure. The church, a beacon for youth like Chanel who sought structure amid chaos, now grappled with the void her absence left. A GoFundMe sprang up almost immediately, strangers and friends alike contributing to ease the burial costs. each donation a thread in the tapestry of communal mourning. Meanwhile, Hezekiah had vanished into the night, his flight a desperate bid to outrun the consequences. Police issued alerts, describing him as a runaway with a history of evading authority. Hours ticked by, the sun rising over the Wasatch Mountains, bathing Ogden in a light that felt mocking in its normalcy. Detectives canvassed the area, interviewing neighbors who recalled hearing the shots but seeing little. Hezekiah's own family, fractured and distant, offered scant leads. He had a pattern of disappearing, couch surfing with friends, or fading into the fringes. But Ogden's law enforcement knew the terrain, the backroads to Davis County, the hidden spots where teens like him sought solace. By midday, a tip led them to Clearfield, just north of Ogden, where Hezekiah was spotted slinking through a quiet neighborhood. Officers moved in swiftly, their unmarked car blocking his path. He didn't resist, his shoulders slumping as handcuffs clicked into place. A search revealed damning evidence. Several ounces of marijuana tucked into his pockets, along with $4,080 in cash, sums that raised eyebrows about his dealings beyond the shooting. No gun, though. Prosecutors would later allege he had disposed of it, a calculated act to sever the link between his hands and the crime. Booked into juvenile detention initially, the gravity of the charges loomed large. This wasn't petty theft or truancy. It was murder, intimate and domestic, the kind that tore at the fabric of young lives. News of the arrest rippled through the Alvarez home, where grief had taken root like a stubborn weed. Chanel's mother sat in the kitchen, staring at the empty chair where her daughter used to chat about school, her hands clutching a photo from last summer's camp. The image showed Chanel laughing, her hair catching the sunlight, oblivious to the shadows ahead. Siblings huddled nearby, their questions unanswered, the house feeling unnaturally large without her presence. Friends gathered outside, placing flowers at the doorstep, their tears watering the petals as they shared stories of Chanel's kindness, how she'd tutor a struggling classmate or stand up for someone bullied in the halls. As the investigation deepened, the pieces aligned inexorably toward Hezekiah. Forensic teams combed the bedroom, lifting prints from the empty gun box, tracing the bullet's trajectory to a point impossibly close, fired from within the room, by someone who knew her well enough to be there in the dead of night. The distant casings suggested a cover story, perhaps shots fired to simulate an external threat, a robbery gone wrong. But the witness's account pierced the facade. Hezekiah's panicked flight, the gun in hand, the hurried blame on an absent assailant. Interviews with his circle revealed a boy on the edge. Arguments with Chanel over his habits, his evasions, the marijuana that clouded his judgments. Domestic violence experts noted the red flags. The control, the volatility in teen relationships where emotions amplified every slight. By Monday, October 20th, prosecutors filed charges in the 2nd District Court in Ogden, elevating Hezekiah to adult status, a decision that underscored the severity. First-degree felony murder under domestic violence statutes carried the weight of life in prison, no parole, for the killing of an intimate partner. Additional counts piled on: obstruction of justice for fleeing and discarding the weapon, theft for taking the Glock, possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute, tied to the marijuana haul, and possession of a dangerous weapon by a minor. Bail was denied. He sat in Weber County Jail, the cell's cold bars a far cry from the freedom he once chased. The community reeled, vigils lighting up the evening skies with candles that flickered like fragile hopes. At Good Shepherd, Pastor Stevenson led a service, his sermon weaving threads of loss and resilience. Chanel's life was a gift, he said, voice steady despite the tears. Her curiosity, her compassion, they remind us to hold our loved ones close, to address the pains that lead to such tragedies. State Representative Gay-Lynn Benyon, whose family had endured domestic violence as scars, spoke out on the need for change. Recent laws mandated risk assessments in DV calls, boosting referrals to shelters by 100%, yet funding lagged. We must prioritize mental health, she urged, her words a call amid the morning. Teens in crisis need providers, not barriers. Days blurred into a haze for the Alvarez family. Funerals came, the church packed with teens in black, their faces streaked with mascara and sorrow. Chanel's casket, adorned with white lilies symbolizing her purity, rested at the front as eulogies painted her legacy. The girl who dreamed of college, who volunteered at camp, who loved fiercely despite the world's cruelties. Her mother spoke last, her voice breaking. "She was my light," she said, clutching the photo. "Gone too soon, but never forgotten." Hezekiah's side remained quieter, his family issuing no statements, the weight of accusation isolating them. Court dates loomed, the legal machinery grinding forward. Detectives continued their work, searching for the discarded gun in Ogden's rivers and fields, each dead end heightening the tension. The case, though straightforward in its outlines, carried layers of human frailty. A relationship strained by youth's impulsivity, a home invaded by unchecked anger, a community forced to confront the domestic shadows that hid in plain sight. As autumn leaves fell outside the courthouse, the story of Chanel Alvarez and Hezekiah Plummer became more than a headline. It was a mirror to society's fractures. In the quiet moments, when sirens faded and lights dimmed, the emotional undercurrents lingered. The love that turned to loss, the trust betrayed by a single shot, the resilience that would carry a family forward. Ogden, forever altered, held its breath, waiting for justice to unfold in the slow dance of trials and truths. Story 7. The heat in Orlando, Florida, is a physical presence. In the summer, it presses down on the manicured lawns and sun-bleached asphalt of suburban neighborhoods, a thick, suffocating blanket that promises afternoon thunderstorms that rarely bring relief. It was in this oppressive summer air of 2008 that a story began to unfold, a story that would hold the nation in a fever grip, a story of a smiling, 2-year-old girl with bright brown eyes and a mother whose lies would become more infamous than the crime she was accused of. The Anthony family lived on Hope Spring Drive in a neat 2-story house that was, from the outside, the very picture of middle-class tranquility. George Anthony, a former police officer, was the patriarch, a man of gruff affection and traditional values. His wife, Cindy, was a nurse, the family's emotional anchor, a woman whose world revolved around her work and, more importantly, her granddaughter. Their son, Lee, was grown and had moved out, but their daughter, Casey, still lived at home. At 22, Casey was a young woman caught between two worlds. She was a mother to the effervescent Kaylee Marie Anthony, yet she yearned for the carefree, unencumbered life of a young woman her age, a life of friends, parties, and romantic entanglements, a life that motherhood had seemingly curtailed. Kaylee was the sun around which the Anthony household orbited. To her grandparents, she was a second chance at parenthood, a source of uncomplicated joy. To her mother, she was something more complex. Casey adored her daughter. That much seemed clear from the endless stream of photos and home videos. But there was a restlessness in Casey, a disconnect between the life she had and the one she so desperately craved. She worked, she told her parents, as an event planner at Universal Studios, a job that required late nights and frequent trips out of town. It was a convenient fiction, one of many she constructed to create space for her real life, a life her parents knew little about. On June 16, 2008, a day that began like any other, Casey walked out of the Hope Spring Drive house with Kaylee in tow. She told her parents she was taking Kaylee to the babysitter, a woman named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, Zani for short, and that she was then going to work. George Anthony saw them leave. It was the last time he would ever see his granddaughter alive. What followed was not the sudden, sharp panic of a child's disappearance, but a slow, creeping dread that unfolded over 31 days. For a month, Casey lived a double life with a chilling audacity. While her parents believed Kaylee was safe with her nanny, Casey was out. She was at nightclubs, entering hot body contests, shopping, and spending time with her new boyfriend, Tony Lazzaro. She was living the life she wanted, unburdened. On her right shoulder, she got a new tattoo, 2 Italian words that would later become a focal point of public condemnation. Bella Vita. Beautiful life. Cindy's calls and texts grew more frequent, more insistent. Where was Kaylee? Why couldn't she talk to her? Casey, a practiced and prodigious liar, had an answer for everything. Zonnie was out of town. They were at the beach in Tampa. Kaylee was at a theme park. The excuses were plausible enough to keep her mother's worst fears at bay, but the anxiety was a constant, low hum. The first tangible sign that something was wrong came not from Casey, but from a tow yard. On June 27th, residents at a local apartment complex had complained about a car that had been abandoned for days. On June 30th, the white Pontiac Sunfire belonging to Casey Anthony was towed to an impound lot. On July 15th, the Anthony family received a notice. Cindy and George, now deeply worried after weeks of Casey's evasions, knew they had to find her. They tracked her down at a friend's apartment. When they confronted her, the dam of lies finally broke. In a tearful confession, Casey admitted that Kaylee was gone. She hadn't seen her in a month. Zonnie the nanny, she claimed, had kidnapped her. George drove to the tow yard to retrieve the car. The moment the lot manager opened the door, the stench hit him like a physical blow. It was a smell he recognized from his days in law enforcement, a smell that is unmistakable and unforgettable. It was the smell of death. I smelled a dead body, he would later testify, his voice heavy with the memory. Inside the trunk, they found a bag of trash, but the odor lingered, thick and putrid, clinging to the carpet. That same day, July 15, 2008, Cindy Anthony picked up the phone and made the call that would ignite a media firestorm. Her voice was a raw mix of terror and fury. "I have someone here that I need to have arrested," she told the 911 dispatcher, referring to Casey. Then came the words that would echo through the years of investigation and trial. "I found my daughter's car today, and it smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car." 31 days after Kaylee Anthony was last seen, she was officially reported missing. The investigation began, and with it, the unraveling of Casey Anthony's world of fiction. She was taken in for questioning, and with a placid, almost detached demeanor, she spun a tale of a devoted nanny who had simply vanished with her child. She led detectives to the apartment complex where she claimed Zonnie lived, only for them to discover the apartment had been vacant for months. The Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez she named did exist, but she had never met Casey or Kaylee Anthony. She then took them to Universal Studios, her supposed workplace. She confidently swiped a card to get in, led them on a meandering walk through the bustling theme park, and finally, with a shrug, admitted she didn't work there anymore. She had been fired years ago. Lie after lie collapsed under the slightest scrutiny. But on one point, she remained unshakable. Kaylee was alive, taken by a phantom nanny, and she had no idea where she was. The more she lied, the more suspicion coalesced around her. She was arrested on July 16th, charged not with murder, but with child neglect and providing false statements to law enforcement. The search for Kaylee Anthony began in earnest, a desperate, nationwide effort fueled by round-the-clock media coverage and the hope of a miracle. Volunteers scoured the swamps and woods of Central Florida. Psychics offered cryptic clues. The face of the missing toddler was everywhere, a cherubic, smiling ghost haunting the national consciousness. While the public searched, forensic investigators began their own painstaking work. They focused on the Pontiac Sunfire, the source of the foul odor. A cadaver dog, trained to detect the specific chemical compounds of human decomposition, gave a positive alert on the trunk. Another dog alerted in the backyard of the Anthony home. Scientists from the FBI and the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee were called in. Dr. Arpad Vass, a specialist in the chemistry of decomposition, analyzed air samples taken from the trunk. He found high levels of chloroform, a chemical that can be used to render someone unconscious, and dozens of other compounds consistent with a decomposing human body. In the trunk liner, they found a single strand of hair. Under a powerful microscope, it revealed a dark, distinctive band near the root, a phenomenon that, according to the FBI expert, only occurred in hairs from a decomposing body. DNA testing confirmed it was a mitochondrial match to Casey and Kaylee Anthony. On the family's home computer, forensic analysts recovered deleted search histories. In the days before Kaylee's disappearance, someone had used the computer to search for chloroform, neck-breaking, and household weapons. A more chilling search, discovered years later, was made on the very day Kaylee was last seen alive. Foolproof suffocation. As the forensic evidence mounted, the web of lies continued. In taped jailhouse conversations with her parents, Casey was a master of manipulation, playing the victim, expressing frustration that the police weren't focusing on finding her daughter, all while revealing nothing. She was indicted by a grand jury on October 14, 2008, on charges of first-degree murder. She pleaded not guilty. The state of Florida announced it would seek the death penalty. For 5 agonizing months, the search for Kaylee continued, a public performance of hope against a backdrop of grim evidence. Then, on December 11, 2008, a meter reader named Roy Kronk was walking through a wooded, swampy area less than half a mile from the Anthony family home. He had called the police about a suspicious bag in the area months earlier, but nothing had come of it. This time, he looked closer. He nudged a black trash bag with his stick and saw something white inside. It was a small human skull. Police descended on the scene. They found the scattered skeletal remains of a small child. The skull had duct tape wrapped around the mouth and nose area. A Winnie the Pooh blanket, one Kaylee was known to love, was found with the bones, all stuffed inside a laundry bag. On December 19th, dental records confirmed the unthinkable. It was Kaylee. The cause of death was listed as homicide by undetermined means. The search was over. The battle was about to begin. The trial of Casey Anthony began on May 24, 2011. It was more than a legal proceeding. It was a national spectacle. The jury was selected from another county and sequestered, shielded from the relentless media storm that had already convicted Casey in the court of public opinion. The prosecution, led by state attorneys Linda Drain Burdick and Jeff Ashton, laid out their case in the opening statements. Their narrative was simple and damning. Casey Anthony was a party girl who saw her 2-year-old daughter not as a blessing, but as an obstacle to the life of freedom she craved. On June 16, 2008, they argued, she used chloroform to render Kaylee unconscious, then placed duct tape over her nose and mouth, suffocating her. She drove around with the body in the trunk of her car for days before dumping it in the woods like a piece of trash. No one makes an accident look like murder, Ashton declared, his words a direct challenge to the defense. Then it was the defense's turn. Jose Baez, Casey's lead attorney, a charismatic and then unknown lawyer, stood before the jury and dropped a bombshell that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Kaylee's death, he said, was a tragic accident. On June 16, 2008, she had drowned in the family's above-ground swimming pool. Her grandfather, George Anthony, was the first to find her. In a state of panic, he had convinced Casey that she would be blamed for child neglect and spend the rest of her life in jail. He, George, had disposed of the body and forced Casey into a month-long lie to cover it up. But Baez wasn't finished. He offered an explanation for Casey's pathological lying, for her bizarrely emotionless behavior. He alleged that for years, since she was a child, Casey had been sexually abused by her father, George Anthony. Her brother, Lee, was also implicated. This trauma, Baez argued, had taught her to dissociate, to live in a world of denial and fabricated realities. It was the only way she knew how to survive. George Anthony, sitting in the courtroom, shook his head in disbelief, his face a mask of anguish and rage. The trial unfolded over 6 weeks, a parade of 400 pieces of evidence and nearly 100 witnesses. The prosecution built its case brick by circumstantial brick. They presented the forensic evidence, the smell of death in the car, the chloroform in the air samples, the single hair with the post-mortem band, the computer searches. They called witnesses who testified to Casey's partying and carefree demeanor in the 31 days her daughter was missing. They played the frantic 911 call from Cindy. They put George Anthony on the stand, where he tearfully denied the horrific allegations of abuse and denied any involvement in a cover-up. Baez and his defense team were relentless in their attack on the prosecution's case. They aimed to create reasonable doubt, and they found fertile ground. The forensic evidence, they argued, was fantasy forensics. Dr. Vass's air sample analysis had never been used in a criminal trial before. Its reliability was questionable. The hair analysis was based on a new, not yet peer-reviewed study. The amount of chloroform found was minuscule. There was no DNA on the duct tape. They chipped away at the credibility of the witnesses. They brought up Roy Cronk's inconsistent statements about when and how he found the body, suggesting he may have been involved. They put Cindy Anthony on the stand, and in a stunning moment, she testified that she was the one who had been searching for chloroform on the family computer, claiming she had been looking up information on chlorophyll in relation to her plants. The prosecution showed work records indicating she was at her job at the time of the searches, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The trial was a masterclass in legal theater. The prosecution presented an image of a monster, a lying, no-good slut, as Baez would later characterize their strategy. The defense presented an image of a victim, a traumatized young woman who had suffered a terrible accident and was now being railroaded by an overzealous prosecution and a public hungry for a villain. Casey Anthony herself did not testify. She sat at the defense table day after day, her expression often unreadable, a blank canvas onto which millions projected their own theories of her guilt or innocence. Closing arguments began on July 3rd. Jeff Ashton, for the prosecution, once again walked the jury through the 31 days of lies, painting them as the actions of a guilty conscience. Responses to grief are as varied as the day is long, Burdick argued in her rebuttal. But responses to guilt are so predictable. What do guilty people do? They lie. They avoid. They run. She ended with a powerful side-by-side image. A photo of Casey partying in a nightclub, and a photo of the Bella Vita tattoo she got while her daughter was missing. Jose Baez, in his closing, hammered home the central theme of his defense. The state had not met its burden of proof. The strategy behind that is, if you hate her, then you'll start to look at this evidence in a different light, he told the jury, urging them to look past their emotional reactions and focus on the gaps in the evidence. There was no definitive cause of death. There was no DNA linking Casey to the crime scene. There was only speculation. He presented the drowning theory as the only explanation that made sense, a plausible, if tragic, alternative to the prosecution's narrative of a cold-blooded murder. The jury, 7 women and 5 men, retired to deliberate on July 4th. For less than 11 hours, they weighed the 6 weeks of testimony. The nation held its breath. On July 5th, 2011, they returned with a verdict. The court clerk read the charges one by one. On the count of first-degree murder, not guilty. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Casey Anthony broke into tears, her body shaking as she hugged Jose Baez. On the count of aggravated child abuse, not guilty. On the count of aggravated manslaughter of a child, not guilty. She was found guilty only on 4 misdemeanor counts of providing false information to law enforcement. The verdict was met with a tidal wave of public fury. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in outrage. Across the country, people took to social media, their posts a torrent of disbelief and anger. The legal pundits, who had confidently predicted a conviction, were left stunned. How could this happen? The jurors, who remained anonymous for months, later explained their decision. The prosecution's case was compelling, but it was circumstantial. They had failed to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, exactly how Kaylee died. If you cannot prove what the crime was, one juror later said, you cannot determine what the punishment should be. They could not sentence a woman to death based on a theory. On July 7th, Casey Anthony was sentenced to 4 years in jail for the misdemeanors, but with credit for time served. She was released just 10 days later, on July 17, 2011. She slipped out of the Orange County Jail in the dead of night and vanished into hiding, a free woman who remains, in the eyes of much of the world, a guilty one. The central mystery remains unsolved. How did Kaylee Anthony die? Was it a cold, calculated murder by a mother desperate for a beautiful life? Or was it a tragic accident in a backyard pool, followed by a panicked cover-up that spiraled into a web of lies too thick to escape? The jury chose reasonable doubt. The public chose conviction. And somewhere in the space between the two, the truth of what happened to a little girl with brown eyes and a radiant smile lies buried, perhaps forever. Story 8. The San Francisco fog, a spectral visitor, crept through the streets of Diamond Heights on the evening of Saturday, May 16, 1998. It wrapped itself around the modern lines of the condominium complex where Lisa Valdez lived, muting the city's distant hum to a low thrum. Inside her studio apartment, however, the world was anything but muted. It was vibrant, warm, and filled with the easy laughter that always seemed to follow Lisa. At 36, Lisa was a force of nature, a woman described by those who loved her as a ball of energy. She was a software analyst, sharp and successful in the burgeoning tech world, but her true essence wasn't found in lines of code. It was in her loyalty, her fierce devotion to her friends and family. Her best friend since the age of 15, Maisa Robinson, knew this better than anyone. Their names rhymed, a small coincidence they felt was a sign of a destined friendship. To Maisa, Lisa was ride or die before that phrase ever came to being. If she was your friend, she was your friend through and through, a constant, brilliant light. That Saturday night, the light was shining on a small dinner party Lisa was hosting. The guest of honor was her mother's boyfriend, a comfortable gathering in the cozy but perpetually cluttered space she called home. The apartment was a reflection of Lisa herself, full of life and perhaps a little chaotic. The main room was dominated by a Murphy bed, a practical solution for a studio, which was currently folded away to make space for her guests. Laughter echoed as the night wore on, a simple, happy evening that held no hint of the darkness to come. Around midnight, the party wound down, and her guests departed into the misty night. Lisa was left alone in the warmth of her apartment, the remnants of a pleasant evening around her. It was the last time anyone close to her would see her alive. For days past, the vibrant energy that defined Lisa Valdez seemed to have vanished from the world. Calls went unanswered. Friends grew worried. Inside the condominium building, a different, more sinister presence began to make itself known. A foul, cloying odor seeped from under the door of Lisa's apartment, disturbing the sterile quiet of the hallway. It was a smell of decay, an unmistakable announcement of death that prompted a call to the police on Wednesday, May 20th, 1998. The officers who responded found the door unlocked. The moment they stepped inside, they were hit by a wave of oppressive heat. The thermostat had been turned up to 80 degrees, accelerating the grim process that had created the smell. The television was on, its silent, flickering screen casting an eerie light on the scene within. The apartment was in its usual state of clutter, but this was a different kind of chaos. The Murphy bed was pulled down but askew, knocked partly off its stand, and on the floor lay Lisa Valdez. Her body was in a state of advanced decomposition, her shirt pulled up over her head, her legs spread. The scene was a tableau of violence and violation. Blood was everywhere, staining the bed, the mattress, the sheets. For retired San Francisco Police Inspector Ronan Scholdes, it was a sight he would never forget, a disturbing image seared into his memory. The ball of energy, the ride-or-die friend, the brilliant light in so many lives, had been brutally extinguished. The initial hours of a murder investigation are a frantic race against time, a desperate effort to capture fleeting evidence and fading memories before they disappear forever. In the case of Lisa Valdez, the investigators who stepped into her small, overheated apartment were already at a disadvantage. The 4 days that had passed since her death had allowed the scene to degrade, the heat acting as a catalyst for decomposition, blurring the timeline and obscuring potential clues. The medical examiner's report painted a brutal picture. Lisa had been stabbed 21 times. The wounds were concentrated on her face, jaw, chin, neck, and chest, a frenzy of violence that spoke of rage. She had defensive wounds on her hands, evidence that she had fought for her life. 3 of the stab wounds had penetrated major blood vessels, causing a rapid, catastrophic loss of blood. Her death would have come within seconds or minutes. But due to the advanced state of decomposition, the examiner could not pinpoint the exact time of death, nor could they determine if a sexual assault had occurred, though the positioning of her body and her partially nude state strongly suggested it. Crime scene investigators worked meticulously, collecting a large number of items from the cluttered apartment. Every stained piece of fabric, every potential piece of physical evidence, was carefully bagged and labeled. They collected a bloody bedsheet, several bloody pillows, and a pair of torn underwear, all bearing witness to the struggle that had taken place. From the bathroom, they retrieved two small but potentially significant items: a pair of Band-Aids found floating in the toilet bowl. The toilet seat was raised, and a partial latent fingerprint was lifted from its underside. Blood streaks on Lisa's door, and even on her neighbor's door, were swabbed for analysis. Lisa's keys and her black gym bag were missing, the only items that seemed to have been taken. There were no signs of a ransacking. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. Leading the investigation was Detective Pamela Hofsass of the SFPD. She and her team began the painstaking work of reconstructing Lisa's final days, starting with the people in her life. They learned about the dinner party, establishing a timeline that ended around midnight on Saturday. But what happened between then and the discovery of her body was a 4-day void. The investigation naturally turned to Lisa's love life. Was there a jealous ex-boyfriend, a spurned lover? Friends told police that Lisa was scheduled to go on a date the day after she was killed with a man named Albert Cato. Cato had apparently canceled the date before her murder, but his name immediately placed him on the list of potential suspects. He was brought in for an interview and cooperated with the police, but the lead didn't solidify. The most crucial discovery, however, came from the lab. As forensic scientists analyzed the blood evidence from the scene, they found something that made the case anything but hopeless. While much of the blood belonged to Lisa, they isolated droplets on her pillows that were not a match. It was the blood of an unknown male. The killer had left a part of himself behind. He had likely been injured during the struggle, perhaps by the same knife he used to take Lisa's life, or by Lisa herself as she fought back. Now, investigators had the two most powerful tools in law enforcement: the killer's fingerprints and his DNA. With this physical evidence in hand, the police had a clear, if daunting, path forward. They had to find the man whose blood was on Lisa's pillow. They began collecting DNA samples from the men in Lisa's life, including Albert Cato, hoping for a match that would break the case wide open. But one by one, the results came back negative. The DNA profile from the crime scene didn't match anyone they had tested. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation stalled. The trail grew cold. The partial fingerprint from the toilet seat yielded no matches in the existing databases. The audio cassette from Lisa's answering machine offered no new leads. A critical piece of evidence, Lisa's computer, which might have contained emails or other clues about her relationships, was somehow lost or not preserved by the police, an oversight that would later be scrutinized. The name of the man who had bled in her apartment remained a mystery. He was a ghost, a phantom with no name and no face, his only signature the microscopic cells he had left behind in a moment of brutal violence. For Lisa's friends and family, the lack of answers was an agony layered on top of their grief. For Detective Hofsass, it was a puzzle she refused to let go of. The file for Lisa Valdez would remain on her desk, a constant, silent promise that justice had not been forgotten. It had only been delayed. Years bled into one another, each one a fresh layer of dust on the cold case file of Lisa Valdez. The vibrant memory of the woman who was a ride or die friend remained painfully fresh for Maisa Robinson, but for the world, the story faded. Maisa felt as though the world should have stopped turning on May 20th, 1998, but it kept spinning, leaving her and Lisa's other loved ones in a private darkness. The case became one of San Francisco's many unsolved homicides, a tragic story that would occasionally surface in a newspaper retrospective before sinking back into obscurity. But in a quiet corner of the San Francisco Police Department, the case was never truly dormant. Detective Pamela Hofsass held on to it, a quiet custodian of a promise made to a victim she had never met. She had learned from her colleagues about the kind of person Lisa was: outgoing, loving, a joy to be around. The sheer senselessness of the crime, the violent end to such a bright life, fueled a determination that time could not erode. Every single year, as forensic technology crept forward, making new leaps in sensitivity and precision, Hofsass would resubmit the evidence from Lisa's apartment. The blood of the unknown male, preserved in waiting, was her primary focus. She sent the DNA profile to be run against state and national databases, a ritual of hope against dwindling odds. For years, the answer was always the same: no match. Meanwhile, a man named Anthony Quinn Hughes was living a life of petty crime and instability. In the years following Lisa's murder, his name appeared on police blotters for burglaries and thefts. He moved through the city's underbelly, a transient figure whose path of low-level criminality went largely unconnected to the brutal slaying in Diamond Heights. In a frustrating twist of fate, Hughes's name had actually been in Lisa's address book and on her caller ID records back in 1998, a lead that had been tragically overlooked during the initial chaotic investigation. In 2002, he was convicted of an unrelated burglary, a crime that should have triggered a mandatory DNA collection under California law. But through another crack in the system, his sample was never taken or processed. The ghost from Lisa's apartment remained nameless, his DNA a key without a lock. For 13 long years, this was the status quo. 13 years of Maisa Robinson's grief. 13 years of a family's unanswered questions. 13 years of Detective Hofsass's patient, dogged persistence. To Robinson, the detective was an angel in a blue suit, a beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness of a cold case. Then, in 2011, everything changed. Advances in DNA technology and the expansion of criminal databases had finally caught up with the ghost. A routine check, one of the many that Hofsass had initiated over the years, returned a hit. The DNA profile from the blood on Lisa Valdez's pillow, the blood of her killer, matched a profile in the system. The profile belonged to a 52-year-old man named Anthony Quinn Hughes. He had finally been compelled to provide a DNA sample following another conviction, and the key had found its lock. After 13 years, the phantom had a name. The discovery sent a shockwave through the SFPD. The cold case was instantly hot. The name Anthony Quinn Hughes was cross-referenced with the original case file and the overlooked clue from 1998. His name in Lisa's address book suddenly blazed with significance. Investigators quickly pieced together his history of crime that spanned the years he had remained free. On September 10, 2011, they located him in the heart of the Tenderloin, one of San Francisco's grittiest neighborhoods. The arrest was just the beginning. The true drama would unfold in the sterile confines of an interrogation room. Hughes was brought in for questioning. He was now a man in his early 50s, his face hardened by years of a rough life. He sat across from the detectives, his demeanor sullen and uncooperative. The detectives began their questioning, circling the events of May 1998, a lifetime ago. Hughes denied everything. He claimed not to know Lisa Valdez, not to have been in her apartment. Then, the detectives played their card. They told him about the blood. They told him that his DNA, and his alone, was found at the scene of a brutal murder that took place 13 years prior. DNA from you was found in Lisa's apartment from 1998, they stated, the words hanging in the air with irrefutable weight. What happened next stunned even the seasoned investigators in the room. As the reality of the evidence cornered him, Hughes did not confess. He did not break down in tears or shout in denial. Instead, in a shocking and desperate act of self-destruction, he grabbed the pen he had been given and plunged it into his own neck. It was a bizarre, violent act, a confession written not in words, but in his own blood, mirroring the violence he had inflicted upon Lisa Valdez more than a decade earlier. The ghost had been unmasked, and in doing so, he had tried to erase himself. But it was too late. Justice, patient and relentless, had finally caught him. The trial of Anthony Quinn Hughes began in San Francisco, bringing the 15-year-old case back into the public eye. For Lisa's friends and family, it was the painful but necessary final chapter. Maisa Robinson was there, her presence a testament to a friendship that death could not sever. She sat in the courtroom, sharing a hug with Detective Pamela Hofsass, the woman she credited with keeping the hope of justice alive. The prosecution, led by the San Francisco District Attorney's Office, built its case on the unshakable foundation of the DNA evidence. The blood on the pillows in Lisa Valdez's apartment belonged to Anthony Quinn Hughes. This was the central, damning fact from which there was no escape. Prosecutors argued that Hughes had gone to Lisa's apartment with the intent to commit a sexual assault, and when she fought back, he had brutally murdered her. They charged him with first-degree murder and attempted rape. Hughes's defense team, facing a mountain of forensic evidence, focused their strategy on the one thing they had in their favor: the passage of time. They filed a motion to dismiss the case, arguing that the 13-year delay in charging Hughes had irreparably damaged his ability to defend himself. Hughes, they claimed, could not remember his activities on the weekend Lisa was killed, and neither could his ex-wife, who might have provided an alibi. Key witnesses' memories had faded. Lisa's housekeeper's recollection of a male voice she might have heard was now hazy. Lisa's friend's memory about who might have been visiting her late that night had become unreliable. Furthermore, they pointed to the mistakes of the initial investigation. The police had failed to preserve Lisa's computer and the answering machine audio tape. They had negligently failed to contact Hughes in 1998, even though his name was in her address book. And they had failed to obtain his DNA in 2002 after his burglary conviction. This delay, they argued, was not just unfortunate, it was a violation of his right to a fair trial. The trial court denied the motion, but allowed the issue to be raised again later. The defense also attempted to point the finger at another person, raising the theory of third-party culpability. They focused on a friend of Lisa's whose unrequited love, they argued, provided a motive for the crime. They tried to introduce hearsay evidence that this friend was planning to visit Lisa's apartment around the time of the murder. However, the judge ruled this evidence inadmissible, finding it insufficiently incriminating and based on untrustworthy, second-hand information. The jury was left to weigh the arguments. On one side was the defense, highlighting the passage of time and the fading of memories. On the other was the prosecution, with its irrefutable scientific proof. The killer's blood, left at the scene, which was a perfect match to Anthony Quinn Hughes. After deliberating, the jury returned a verdict. They found Anthony Quinn Hughes guilty of the murder of Lisa Valdez. However, the legal process wasn't over. On the charge of attempted rape, the jury could not reach a unanimous decision, and a mistrial was declared on that count. When it came to sentencing, the judge made a significant decision. While the jury had convicted Hughes of first-degree murder, which requires proof of premeditation and deliberation, the judge reduced the conviction to second-degree murder. In the judge's view, the prosecution had not presented sufficient evidence to prove that the murder was planned in advance. It was a brutal, horrific crime, but legally, it was deemed to have been committed without premeditation. Finally, nearly 2 decades after Lisa Valdez drew her last breath, her killer was sentenced. Anthony Quinn Hughes was given a term of 16 years to life in prison. He was sent to the California Health Care Facility in Stockton to serve his sentence. To the very end, he maintained his innocence, claiming he had been wrongly accused. For Maisa Robinson, the sentence brought a sense of closure, though it could never fill the void Lisa left behind. That light was extinguished in such a violent way that truly I fell into darkness, she remembered. The conviction was a confirmation that Lisa's life mattered, that she had not been forgotten. It was a victory for the quiet, relentless police work of Detective Hofsass and her team. Robinson hoped her friend's story would remind people that even amid tensions between the public and the police, there are angels walking around in blue suits. The case of Lisa Valdez is a story of contrasts. It is a story of a vibrant life cut short by brutal, senseless violence. It is a story of a cold case, frozen in time by a lack of evidence, and a story of a breakthrough, thawed by the heat of scientific advancement. It is a story of investigative failures and of one detective's unwavering persistence. But most of all, it is a human story about the enduring power of friendship, the hollowing pain of loss, and the slow, grinding, but ultimately triumphant path of justice. Lisa Valdez, the ball of energy, was silenced in 1998, but the echo of her life and the fight for her memory ultimately brought her killer out of the shadows and into the light of accountability.